What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Primetime Sports Podcast, hosted by Jerod Mayo. So this is now my third episode back in the WZBC studio over the last week now. So 3 episodes back here in the WZBC studio. It's obviously great to be back. Always loved doing this when I was an undergrad student. Did a few times as a graduate student last year, and now I'm still a graduate student. And now I've taken advantage of the ability to come in here and still talk some sports when I get the chance. So hopefully you guys do enjoy this. This is going to be a lot about the NFL. I'm going to talk about some of the head coaches that have been fired, some of the ones that will be staying and that are safe. And then I'll move on to talk about Aaron Rodgers and his great game yesterday, which I thought would happen. I'll talk about Bryce Young and his transformation over the last 10 games. And then I'll talk about Tyreek Hill, who wants out of Miami. Then if I have a minute, I'll talk a little bit about the NBA. And I'll break down some trade packages I have ready to go that I've been meaning to break down over the past few weeks. So let's start off with the head coaching carousel in the NFL. First off, Jerod Mayo was fired by the New England Patriots yesterday, about an hour after the game ended. The Patriots had a nice win over Buffalo. Buffalo did rest just about every one of their starters for the most part, besides Josh Allen playing in, I think it was just one drive. If you look at what the Patriots did, they started Drake May. He ended up going one offensive drive, took him out, put Joe Milton in. Milton actually had a decent game, had 10 carries to 15 yards and a rushing touchdown, did fumble as well, and had an interception. Oh, no, he did not have an interception. I do apologize. That was his lone turnover, was that fumble. 22 of 29 passing, 76% completion percentage, 241 passing yards, and a passing touchdown. He looked pretty good, honestly, yesterday. I was pretty impressed with his raw skill from the few minutes I watched of the game. His arm talent definitely stood out. His mobility stood out. Obviously, how big he is as well. All of those attributes did stand out when you watched him play yesterday. The Patriots got a big win. When you're a Giants fan, it's a big win looking at it. I think the Patriots fans are, for the most part, upset with that win, considering now they fall from the first overall pick to the 4th overall pick with that win, now with the 4-12 or 4-13 record overall. The Giants, we're happy with that win. Now the Giants now have the 3rd overall pick in the draft rather than the 4th overall pick. So the Giants move up 1 draft slot there. For the Patriots, they did fire Jerod Mayo, as I mentioned. It wasn't something that a lot of people saw as unexpected. A lot of people thought he would end up being fired. I thought it was a little bit unexpected considering you don't see first-year coaches get fired often. And I think there's been one every single year over the last 3 or 4 years that have been fired within their first season ending. But I think it's a little bit crazy to fire a coach after 1 year, especially one like Jerod Mayo, where there weren't really many expectations around the Patriots to do well this past season. When you don't really have high expectations to win, I think it's a little bit tough just to fire a head coach on a limb like the Patriots did. And I wouldn't necessarily say it was on a limb. They did give Jerod Mayo a chance this whole season, a full year, 17 games. 17 games is a small sample size, but it's maybe sometimes enough to see if you have the right or the wrong guy. The Patriots felt like they didn't have the right guy, and in those 17 games, they made the decision at the end of it that it was best to move on from Jerod Mayo. I do feel like, though, when you look at that Patriots team, as I mentioned, they are missing a lot of talent. If you look at the Patriots wide receiver core, not really many talented players at the receiver position that can help you out and make big plays. And then if you look at it at the offensive line, there's definitely still problems in the offensive line. Trading Matthew Judon before the season began, that was obviously tough, and I think that was something that is a little bit held against Jerod Mayo, considering all Jerod Mayo had to face over the course of the year, which obviously there were some injuries to the Patriots. There was, should they start Drake May or should they start Jacoby Brissett? There was a lot of turmoil around the team and a lot of questions around the team. And then you added the fact that Jerod Mayo had some issues as well with the media, calling players out, basically blaming players at one point and coaches, also calling his team soft after their loss in London against the Jacksonville Jaguars. A lot of those things did hurt his chances to stay as the head coach. I just feel like sometimes firing a head coach after 1 year is just really tough to do, considering sometimes, the expectations around a team are very low. The Patriots weren't really expected to win many games. I think people probably had them around 3, 4, maybe 5 wins tops. They ended up winning 4 games this season. But I think maybe the fashion that they lost a lot of those games, sometimes it was blowouts. Sometimes after the game, he'd be calling players out or coaches in the media. That was obviously something that is an issue. And then you look at Matthew Judon and Jerod Mayo's issues in the offseason and right before the season began. Obviously, there was a divide there as well that was highly mentioned a lot in the media, was, them two going back and forth. I think it was during an OTA or maybe a training camp practice with Mayo and Judon going back and forth in public with people being able to observe. I think that was obviously tough for Jerod Mayo. So I think a lot of things were against him if you look at his time in New England. I think obviously not having any head coaching experience if he was going to struggle this season, a lot of people are going to point to him not having any other prior head coaching experience. And then you also look at it from the perspective of he was guaranteed to get this job after Belichick left. After Bill Belichick left last season, the Patriots parted ways with him amicably. You look at his time with the Patriots as obviously one of the best head coaches in all of sports history, walking away. And then Jerod Mayo steps in where there was a clause in his contract about 2 or 3 years ago when teams were trying to interview Jerod Mayo for the head coaching position at their respective teams. The Patriots had a clause in his contract that when Belichick does move on, he will be the next head coach of the Patriots. So that prevented him from interviewing with other teams. And if you look at it, when you're stepping in and you have to fill the shoes of Bill Belichick, that's just really, really hard to do. And then you look at the Patriots' talent, as I said, this was a team that was rebuilding. There were not high expectations around this team at all. So I think it's really tough to fire a head coach after one season. But his issues in the media were definitely a problem. And then you also look at the fact that the team did play, lackluster at times. The Patriots did have some games where they just did not show up, and that is definitely an issue. So that ends up being the case for Jerod Mayo. He is fired and now is able to go to whatever team he wants to. I think he'll probably get another defensive coordinator position at some point. Another head coach that was fired was Doug Pederson, who had 2 good years, or one really good year in Jacksonville. Last year missed the playoffs because he lost a last week of the regular season game against Tennessee, if I remember correctly, and that prevented him from making the playoffs with Jacksonville. That would have been 2 years in a row with Jacksonville making the playoffs. Then this season, really disappointing year for Jacksonville, winning just 4 games, going 4-13 overall. Obviously, Trevor Lawrence's injuries did not help. And then you look at some other issues, on defense as well as problems. This team just was in a tough position this season when Trevor Lawrence got hurt, handing over the reins to Mac Jones. Really just prevented them from being able to, reach the ceiling that a lot of people expected. And that's not taking away from Mac Jones. I think Mac Jones had some moments there where he showed that he still could play, be a quarterback in the NFL and potentially maybe get himself at another starting chance, somewhere else, potentially if a team's rebuilding and they need a bridge quarterback. I think Mac Jones will still get another chance at some point. But I do think Mac Jones's, ceiling and Trevor Lawrence's ceiling are 2 very different places. And that's why I think when Trevor Lawrence went down with the injury, his season ended, I think that really did hurt that Jacksonville offense and probably their locker room as well. Trevor Lawrence, obviously one of the most talented players in the NFL, has struggled at times over the course of the last 2 seasons. So that's something I'm not going to, pretend that, isn't happening. Trevor Lawrence definitely has struggled the last couple seasons. There's definitely a lot on film when you watch that you need to see him improve upon. He has struggled, as I said, so there are still some things he has to work on. He has not been great the last few years. It's honestly been disappointing watching him play. But I still think his ceiling is very high, and that's why I'd love to see him on the New York Giants. But I don't think the Giants are going to go and trade for him. But that would be a dream come true scenario for me, considering I'm very high in Trevor Lawrence and his talent. I think if you're rebuilding a team or you're basically starting a franchise from scratch, Trevor Lawrence would still be a high pick in a lot of general managers' eyes, considering his young talent, his age, obviously the arm. And then you look at Trevor Lawrence's size as well. He has a lot of talent, so I wouldn't be surprised, if a lot of teams would try to pick him high if there was a rebuild of the NFL. And that's obviously hypothetical. That's never going to happen. But I do think Trevor Lawrence would be high on a lot of people's list. Nevertheless, Doug Pederson and his time in Jacksonville, I expected this to probably be the end for them. Just a really tough season for them. And missing the playoffs last year was just really disappointing. They had a chance to be winning into the playoffs, and they end up losing. So when you get a winning chance, you got to really take that. Obviously, if you win the game, you make the playoffs, and then, anything can happen. They ended up, losing that chance last year by losing in that last game of the regular season against Tennessee. And I think that definitely, maybe played a role in them maybe having a bad taste in their mouth heading into this season. And then obviously this year was just really disappointing. So I was not surprised about Pederson being fired. Jerod Mayo, honestly, I thought he would end up staying. I thought the Patriots would give him another chance. But once again, I'm not really too surprised considering he didn't really have too much. So experience was definitely an issue for Jerod Mayo, and then you look at his issues in the media, and the Patriots obviously having a disappointing season. And I know a lot of fans expected more from this team, but 4 wins, still a disappointing season, but I didn't really see this team being much better than that. Maybe 5 wins tops, but I thought this team was a 4-win team considering their poor offensive line, poor weapons, obviously a rookie quarterback in Drake May, and then you lose Matthew Judon right before the season began. I just think it would have been tough for this Patriots team to win any more than 4 games. So I didn't really expect too much from them, but I wasn't really too surprised with Jerod Mayo being fired. I think if you look at Jerod Mayo, there are some better head coaching candidates out there that I mentioned yesterday on my podcast. Lovie Smith was a guy that was let go by the Houston Texans two years ago now, and he had a chance to have the Texans have the first overall pick. He ends up winning the last game of the regular season, and that makes them drop to the second overall pick, and that was his basically last goodbye to the Houston Texans. The same goes for Jerod Mayo. I think Jerod Mayo, just like Lovie Smith, probably knew they were gone before yesterday's game, just like Lovie Smith probably knew he was gone before the last game of the regular season back in the 2022 season. And he ends up winning yesterday, Jerod Mayo, and the Patriots fall from the first pick to the fourth pick, and maybe that was his goodbye, leaving the door saying, if you're going to fire me before the season ends, obviously that's going to hurt the Patriots draft pick there. But I don't think Jerod Mayo or any head coach or general manager or player in the league necessarily wants just to lose just because they want a higher draft pick. At the end of the day, these coaches and these players are really fighting, for future contracts and to stay in the league. So I don't think anybody necessarily wants to tank and lose on purpose. But Jerod Mayo ends up winning, and that could technically be an audition for another team potentially if there's a team that maybe will want him to be their defensive coordinator after, this offseason, window of, defense coordinators being fired, which Lou Anarumo is just fired by Cincinnati. Maybe he ends up going there at some point. We'll have to see there. One guy that is safe is Brian Daboll. Also, Joe Schoen, the Giants' general manager. Both of them will be safe and back for another season with the Giants. It only made sense to probably go either both being fired or keeping both. I thought the Giants would keep Joe Schoen and fire Brian Daboll. I think with Brian Daboll, there's obviously a lot of promise there considering how good the Giants were year one with Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll, and I think the Giants are very high on Daboll. I think that's why John Mara didn't want to move on from him. But the reality is the Giants team just did not play hard for many games at the end of the season. Besides that win over Indianapolis, it was last week, the Giants' defense and offense really just didn't show up for the majority of the last maybe 8 games of the season. So I thought that might have been something that held Brian Daboll back from being back with the New York Giants, but that ends up not being the case. John Mara wants both back, to hold their respective positions. And I think, honestly, it's not a bad idea. I think if you're going to keep one and let the other leave, I just think that's not really the best way to do it. You either clear house or keep everyone, meaning the two biggest positions in the football, department, being the head coach and the GM. I think you keep both of them or either fire both of them. I think it makes sense to keep both of them considering they're going to give the Giants one more chance to obviously figure it out. I think John Mara, that is going to give Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll one more chance to try to figure out the quarterback position, whether it's going out and trading for a guy, whether it's drafting a guy in the draft, whether it's getting a bridge quarterback and doing something else. They're going to give those two guys one more chance to try to figure things out. I think that makes sense at the end of the day, just because I think just firing a head coach every other 3 years is just not really a great cycle the Giants want to continue. It just seems like every other year there's promise, things go well, and then before you know it, things fall apart, and that head coach is ending up in reports where they're going to be fired potentially. And that ended up being the case with Pat Shurmur even. Shurmur was with the New York Giants, I believe, it was 2 seasons, the 2018 and 2019 seasons. The Giants ended up firing him after the 2019 season, and then they ended up going on to Joe Judge. Joe Judge had some promise in year one, definitely looked like the team rallied around him, and then the next couple years, just things completely fell apart on him in 2021. And it was 2021, so he was only with the New York Giants for 2 years. And then in 2022, Brian Daboll steps in. A lot of promise, obviously, in year one. Then in 2023 and 2024, things just completely fell apart. It just seems like the Giants are on the downtrend. So that just seems like the history of the New York Giants at the head coaching position over the last 10 years. There's a lot of promise. Things are looking up. And then before you know it, things are falling apart, and the Giants are looking for the next head coach. I think John Mara wanted to keep that cycle going, and that's why he ends up bringing both of those guys back, for the next season in 2025. So the Patriots falling from the first to the fourth overall pick definitely helps the New York Giants, as I mentioned. They'll now have the third overall pick, and they'll have a chance at either Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward, or potentially maybe even Travis Hunter as well. So the Giants are in a decent spot there, now being, at the third overall pick position. They don't necessarily always have to trade up now if they want to go out and get a quarterback. I think if you look at the New York Giants, the way they stand, I think the quarterback position is something that is a big need for them. But I think there's some other issues as well in the secondary, the offensive line, even at the linebacker position. I think the Giants had issues with missed tackles, had issues in coverage this year, and then also on the offensive line. I think all of those things need to be addressed this offseason. So we'll see what the Giants do this offseason, but I will give Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll one more chance because obviously there was a lot of promise in year one in 2022, bringing the Giants their first playoff run since 2016, getting the Giants their first playoff win since 2012 when they won the Super Bowl over the Patriots. It's obviously great that the Giants had a great year one. That was a very promising year, but the last 2 years have been really disappointing. But I'm excited to see what these two guys do next year. They know obviously their back's against the wall. They have no option but to show progress in results, or otherwise they're going to be, out the door and they're going to be fired. So we'll see what they do next year for the New York Giants. We'll move on now and talk about Aaron Rodgers, who balled out in his last game. with the New York Jets potentially. I think he's probably gone from the Jets. I think if he plays another year, it's going to be somewhere else. Played very well yesterday. 23 of 36 passing, 274 yards, 4 passing touchdowns and an interception. Rodgers became the 4th quarterback since 2018 to throw 4 touchdown passes under pressure. He ended up being the first quarterback to do so since Russell Wilson in Week 2 of the 2020 season. So only the 4th quarterback since 2018 to throw 4 touchdowns under pressure. That is very impressive. I think if you look at Rodgers' numbers from yesterday, the 274 passing yards are impressive. Went out, obviously, with a bang in that regard. And then you look at under pressure, he played really well yesterday. He was under pressure on 46.2% of his dropbacks, which was the highest pressure rate he faced all season, and that's per Next Gen Stats. And he played very well against pressure in that game, obviously throwing 4 touchdowns. He found Davante Adams for 1 more touchdown. Very nice moment between the two of them. They had 83 career touchdowns between the two of them. And if that's it between those two guys, it was a joy watching those two guys play over the years. Over the last 5 years, I've always had high expectations for whatever team Aaron Rodgers is on. So I'll repeat those yet again. It was the 2020 season I was very high on Green Bay, and the 2021 season, and then the 2022 season was a down year for them. But then 2023 and 2024 with the New York Jets, I was very high on them. So 4 of the last 5 years, I've had very, very high expectations for Aaron Rodgers' teams. I thought maybe even the last 2 years, the Jets could have gone to the AFC Championship at the very least, just like I thought they could have won the Super Bowl back in 2020 and 2021. That obviously ended up not being the case. But I'm a big fan of Aaron Rodgers in his game. I think over the years, I became very appreciative of greatness. I think one thing I've mentioned on my radio show in the past was at the end of the day, when guys like Tom Brady, LeBron James, and Tom Brady's already retired now, but guys like that in that same class, Tom Brady, LeBron James, Derek Jeter, for example, you got to appreciate greatness when you can, because at the end of the day, once those guys move on and they're gone, obviously the league's going to look a lot different, and the league looks a lot different now without Tom Brady. So Aaron Rodgers, I've always told people to appreciate his greatness, considering how great he was over the course of his career, one of the most talented players to ever play the game of football. And I think if you look at it, he's still very productive. He had a very good season, obviously, with 28 passing touchdowns. I know the win-loss record is an issue, only winning 5 games, but he started all 17 games. That's pretty impressive for a guy that's 40 and 41 years old, during the course of the season, coming off an Achilles injury from last season, throwing 28 touchdowns, which was the 3rd most in a single season for the Jets franchise in their history. 28 touchdowns is impressive, 11 picks, 38.97 for his passing yards, so just about 3,900 passing yards on the year. Had a good season overall. I think obviously the win-loss record is what matters most, and only winning 5 games is an issue, but I think Aaron Rodgers proved that he can still play at a high level in the NFL. I don't know if he's still going to play next season. I think there's definitely going to be a question mark about that all offseason, and hopefully he does. I've always enjoyed watching him play, as I mentioned. But if that's it for Aaron Rodgers and Davante Adams together, I thought it was great to see Rodgers force 1 more touchdown to Adams yesterday. Rodgers potentially could have even ran in the touchdown yesterday that he threw to Davante Adams. He was just about the 3 or 4 yard line and chose to not go over the line of scrimmage because he wanted to get that ball over to Davante Adams for 1 more score. And that ended up being the case. It ended up working out. Adams got 1 more touchdown from Rodgers for 83 total in his career together. So that's obviously great considering the amount of connections they've had over the years between Green Bay and New York. I think obviously the Davante Adams trade didn't really work out, but Rodgers wanted his guy. Rodgers always has mentioned, Davante Adams is one of his best friends. So I don't think Aaron Rodgers really even cared, but necessarily that the team struggled. I think he was just happy, to have 1 more run with Davante Adams and have him on his side in his locker room and in the huddle with him for just 1 more season. Obviously, those 2 guys are brothers. They're going to be best friends forever, and that's something Aaron Rodgers mentioned yesterday in the post-game press conference. A lot of reporters were asking him whether or not he's going to come back, and he mentioned, obviously he's going to take some time to think about it, and he's not going to come to an answer right now. But he did talk about how important and special it was to walk off the field with Davante Adams. Who knows what the future holds for either player in New York. I think they're both probably no longer New York Jets next season. I think Rodgers potentially does play next season. I think Davante Adams and him will be a package deal. Adams does still have, I believe, a year left on his contract, maybe 2 years left on his contract. So if the Jets want to move on from him, they're probably not going to cut him because I think there'd be a good amount of dead cap hit against them. So I think they could potentially maybe try to trade him, to maybe a team that Rodgers ends up going to. Or Adams actually has an opt-out. He has 2 years left on his deal. Now I remember correctly. He has 2 years left on his deal, but he can potentially opt out after the season ends if he ends up wanting, to go somewhere else and play where Aaron Rodgers goes. So I think if Rodgers does end up playing for another year, he'll end up opting out, maybe just have the okay to go to wherever he wants. If Rodgers ends up retiring, I think probably Adams will opt into that deal just to get that guaranteed money, over the next 2 seasons. I thought it was very nice, though, that he threw 1 more touchdown pass to Adams, and Rodgers had a great career. If this is it for him, He threw over 500 touchdown passes, which he had 499 heading into yesterday. Now he finishes, if yesterday were to be it, he'd be finishing with 503 touchdown passes in his career, which is very, very impressive. I think Aaron Rodgers is a guy that a lot of people have criticized over the course of his career, and obviously he's had issues in the media and stuff like that, but 500 touchdown passes is very, very impressive. And I think if you look at his career overall, only one Super Bowl ring is something that does loom large, considering they had a lot of chances to win in Green Bay. And even with the New York Jets, I mean, people had high expectations, just like I did over the last couple seasons. But Rodgers, obviously, one ring is all, still obviously is a Super Bowl champion at the end of the day. Finishes with 503 touchdown passes, which is fifth most all-time, trailing just Brett Favre, Peyton Manning, Drew Brees, and Tom Brady. So very impressive run there for Aaron Rodgers. That's it. But as I've mentioned, I hope he does come back for another season. I still think he can play at a high level, 28 touchdowns and 11 picks on the season. I think I had an episode just about 2 or 3 weeks ago where I mentioned Aaron Rodgers, and I thought maybe he was getting more towards the washed-up stage of his career. But I even think now when I watched his game yesterday, I still think he can play at a high level. If he can play like that against pressure and still find guys and throw 4 touchdowns, even if it's in a meaningless game, I still think it's very impressive. I think Aaron Rodgers still could maybe play. So I'll take back what I said maybe a few weeks ago, thinking maybe, he was on the tail end of his playing days, potentially. And I think he might retire anyways, but the point of what I'm saying is I thought potentially he should retire maybe because he couldn't produce like he used to. When I watched him play yesterday and over the last couple games, obviously last week was a really tough game for him, but yesterday he looked like he still could play, for another few seasons in the NFL potentially. So we'll see what happens there. Now I'm going to move on. I'll stay in the AFC East. I'm going to talk about Tyreek Hill really quickly, who looks like he wants out of Miami. It seems like he stopped playing in the fourth quarter yesterday, even though he wasn't hurt. Still under contract for at least one more year with a $27 million cap hit. He did say yesterday in a post-game press conference that he does probably want out of Miami is what it seems like. So this is what Tyreek Hill said after yesterday's game. "I'm opening the door. I'm out, bro. It was great playing here, but at the end of the day, I got to do what's best for my career. I'm too much of a competitor just to be out there." So it looks like he ends up saying he probably wants out of Miami. And then obviously Mike McDaniel, the head coach of the Miami Dolphins, makes, a comment about it after the game. And he basically said he's not going to try to let, just a comment, after the game ends, affect, his future in Miami. Maybe, potentially Mike McDaniel thought maybe it was just an overreaction to the loss and he wanted out just because they lost the game. But it seems like he ends up really meaning that he doesn't want out, which would be tough for Miami. I do think he was telling the truth yesterday, though. I think he ends up moving on, and I think the Miami Dolphins probably trade him. As I said, he's still under contract for at least one more season with the $27 million cap hit. He did tie his career low for touchdowns with 6 this season, which he last had as a rookie. So not his best year, but obviously Tua Tagovailoa having an injury was an issue, and then Tyreek Hill was battling injuries all season long as well, finishing with 81 catches, 959 yards, and 6 touchdowns. Still a good season, but obviously not the year that you expect from Tyreek Hill. He's a superstar player, so I think everyone always expects 100 catches, at least 1,000 yards, around 8 to 10 touchdowns at the very least. But it looks like he wants out of Miami. I think Mike McDaniel tried to, at least better the situation yesterday after the game by saying he'll talk with Tyreek and maybe, see how he feels after that. And he thought maybe it was just an overreaction to the loss and thought it was just maybe, we're just getting off the field. So he feels this way just because we just lost and obviously the season's over with. But I think Tyreek Hill, the way he feels, is probably true from what he said yesterday, and especially if he didn't play in the fourth quarter of that game. I think he meant every word he said after that game ended yesterday. I don't think he ends up staying in Miami. I think he wants out. I think that's very clear for you to play in the fourth quarter yesterday, and I think that's something they're gonna have to deal with this offseason, is potentially trying to move him. So anyways, that'll wrap up this episode. I do have to run back to work, but thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to this. As always, I appreciate it. I'll be back on air hopefully again soon. I do still have more I want to talk about. Definitely want to talk more about the NBA. I have some other things in the NFL I want to talk about as well. I know we got the wild card weekend coming up next weekend. I also want to talk about Bryce Young and how great he's been playing. He's a guy I stuck with through all of the ups and downs. I know a lot of people gave up on him, but I stayed with Bryce Young through a lot of the ups and downs. So I'm excited to see what he does next year for Carolina. But that will be it. I do have to run back to work, as I mentioned. But thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to this. As always, I appreciate it. I hope you guys have a good one. I will see you guys in the next episode. Thank you.